G'day, Agent Mahara here. Welcome back or welcome to the channel. Relationships with people with borderline personality disorder, especially untreated, and how they really are, on the part of people with BPD, an unconscious setup of not only the person that they're going to relate to, love bomb, and idealize, and that person, usually when you're that person or you've been that person, you don't know what's going on, right? In the beginning, you might not have ever heard of BPD. And so this setup that is unconscious on the part of people with BPD, it's gonna really hurt you, and it also really hurts them. But here's the thing. It's there from the moment that you meet. It's there from the moment that a relationship, dating, and a relationship begins. Because due to the repetition compulsion cycles deeply ingrained in the unconscious mind of people with untreated borderline personality disorder, every beginning of a relationship in any type is also the beginning of the end of the repetition compulsion on the part of people with BPD, which is an unconscious process of relational rupture. The reality that, as I've talked about, the impossibility of being in relationship to an untreated borderline or having a relationship with an untreated borderline is an impossibility. And so people will take their own time and be devastated in so many ways to come to this realization, as I know many people have. Many people are still in the beginnings of trying to work on how to heal from all this, and realizing that there's codependency on their part and like on your part, and what does that really mean? And some people are aware of that before these relationships, and when they eventually rupture, because all relationships with people with untreated BPD are, there's really no other way to put it, but they're doomed from the get-go, which nobody, on the non-borderline side can understand or can know or foresee. And people untreated with BPD, this is such an unconscious repetition compulsion from their childhood, and what the mental illness has to do with, but what, more to the point, the trauma that is the mental illness forms. And what that means is, like I said in a live stream last night, there are the loss of self, the arrested emotional development, and the reality that people with BPD really untreated do not understand what they're experiencing. They're experiencing a lot of triggers, a lot of wanting to be loved, a lot of trying to get into a relationship, but they don't understand where all their limitations are and why. And those are limitations that can be changed and healed and in long-term therapy and not be limitations anymore. But so from the get-go of all of the beginnings of all of these relationships with untreated people with BPD, they unconsciously, not consciously known to them, have a repetition compulsion that in one way or the other must end in relational rupture. Whether it's that you leave them or they ghost or discard you, it's based on what happened in early childhood, in infancy really. It goes all the way back to not being able to attach in any secure way, if at all, to the feeling abandoned, the being abandoned often, but the feeling that comes at such a young age when there's misattunement in affect synchrony. And when the mother isn't mirroring back what the child needs to develop. And that infants see mother's face as the world, and mother is the first object. And when that goes awry, it's a relational rupture right there. It could happen for an infant at a week of age. It could happen at 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 months of age. And it's not going to be anything that shows on the outside. It's not going to be anything that a young human infant is going to be aware of in any cognitive way, really any emotional way. It's a biological threat to survival. And that's why there's that psychological loss of self to the otherwise burgeoning authentic self in this arrested development. As human beings, there's a considerable amount of fragility to what it means to be human, especially to be a human infant, and then a young toddler and a young child. And the stages of early childhood development, each stage and phase completed successfully, achieved successfully, with the support of a healthy caregiving parent, a healthy parent, is what's required. Because if a child doesn't get through, this stage and then the next stage, the first stage, the second stage, the third stage of early childhood development, well, then they're going to experience emotional arrested development, whereby they just don't make it through the rest of those early childhood stages of development. So the repetition compulsion and people with borderline personality is this relationship, trying to get to be in a relationship with somebody, or any type or form of relationship, is going to trigger them back to the early childhood experience that they have no recall and memory of. But it's sort of trauma at this point that's housed in the body. But the thing with that is it's going to be in their unconscious. It's not going to be in their conscious awareness. And so it sets up both people with BPD untreated, and it sets up the partner also, the non-borderline, in ways that neither can conceive of. And unless people with BPD get to therapy and get a lot of significant treatment in a psychodynamic modality, they're never going to become aware of this. So the beginning of every relationship with a person with untreated BPD brings with it the idealization phase, but also an idealization brings with it something not so experienced or seen by others, and maybe for a time temporarily not felt by the person with BPD, but comes this connecting or trying to connect, let alone trying to get intimate or feel your love or take in your love, which they can't do. Even just being in that territory, in that region of the way they'll try. It's a recipe for not only relational impossibility, but disaster, because it is the beginning of the end. And who could know that when you think about BPD idealization? Who could the non-borderline can't know that, and the untreated borderline doesn't know that either. It's going to go back to the very primal woundedness. And there's where the repetition compulsion lies, deep in the unconscious mind and awareness of people with BPD. So each and every relationship is actually really doomed from the start for both parties, and nobody knows that on a conscious level. And then people kind of wonder later, because you can't know it. People with BPD untreated don't know it. But anytime they try to attach, and they don't attach to you, make no mistake about it, if they're untreated, anytime they try to love, and they don't really love you in any adult, healthy, reciprocal, age-appropriate way, and anytime they try to be loved or be attached to, there's no self there to take that in, and it becomes just an incredible threat to them, which triggers them back to that primal, what is for many people with BPD was the first trauma bond, but it was so severe that they had to protect themselves in ways infants can't protect themselves a lot, but they had to set things aside, really, is the way John Bradshaw puts it, at first. And then, because there's nothing else that an infant can do with an angry face or with a misattuned face of mother, the world, the caregiver, the first love object. It all goes awry right there. And so in these relationships, as much as they show promise, and untreated people with BPD don't know this consciously, and non-borderlines aren't going to have a clue in the beginning. You can't know this. So, but what I hope it will be informative to you to think about it in retrospect, which is obviously the most painful way to find out about this, but it might help explain it to people that this isn't even people with untreated borderline personality disorder. It's not their fault either. Now, a lot of their behavior and what they might do in a relationship, yes, they need to be held accountable and responsible for that, even if they don't know how to take that responsibility or accountability. But as to the way that the relationships, when they begin, are destined to be ruptured, destined to blow apart one way or another, sooner or later, because it's the repetition compulsion of the primal core woundedness of people with borderline personality disorder. And they don't know that, so it's not some conscious setup. But what I am really trying to impart here is that all relationship types with somebody with untreated BPD, even a family member, a sibling, a friend, a favorite person, anybody in any relationship type, and especially in significant other relationships, but it happens across all relationship types, is going to experience, like even the friends, they're going to, largely in this untreated percentage of people with BPD, male or female, the relationships begin under the cloud of guaranteed repetition compulsion to relational rupture. It's all that people with BPD untreated and more severely affected, but even in mid-range being affected, it's all they've experienced and it's all they know how to do, because the defenses are so unconscious to start with. And splitting is the major defense of those with borderline personality disorder. And there are narcissistic defenses in borderline personality disorder. And splitting could be seen as one of those because narcissists also split. Not the same as people with BPD, though. The whole thing isn't driven, motivated, the same, and etc. Just know that in your relationship or your past relationship, or if you're the adult child of a parent, and you're like struggling to try, you might need to go no contact, but you're struggling because you don't want to do that, and that's a whole, very painful process onto itself. And I'm out here to work with people in healing and recovery from these aspects and these relationships, if you resonate with me. But all relationships with untreated borderlines are a setup, an unconscious setup that affects both the person with BPD and the non-borderline in any relationship type, because all they have learned in childhood is the horror and the trauma of not being able to attach, of being abandoned, of not getting through the early stages of childhood development, even in a bruised up way. They don't get there. They don't get through it at all. So relational rupture is the ultimate repetition compulsion defense in borderline personality disorder. And it can be changed, and it can be unlearned, and other ways of relating can be learned, but that's what takes 8 to 16 years of treatment and in a recovery process and a healing process from borderline personality. I hope this makes sense and gives you maybe a basis of understanding that there's no way it was your fault if you're the non-borderline partner or a sibling or a family member or adult child, and you just can't continue to be in contact with that person anymore. You just can't stay in whatever the relationship type is anymore, because you were set up, but they also were set up, because it's an unconscious repetition compulsion of ruptured relationship, ruptured relating that happens to them very, very young and creates very rigid, bounded, narcissistic, infantile defenses. And then they're going to get triggered every time they try to attach, or you're feeling attached to them, or they're trying to love, or you are loving them and they can't take it in. This is why there is never the accomplishment, the completion, or the achievement of emotional intimacy with an untreated borderline. They don't get your love. They don't feel your love. That's not what causes the splitting, because it's the very nature of this primal woundedness, this repetition compulsion that is destined to rupture relationally inside of people with BPD on an unconscious level, that, and the lack of self, they can't possibly take in your love to a point, or be really emotionally have intimacy in any way, shape, or form. And it threatens their absolute survival, because it triggers them back to when their survival was literally biologically felt to be in jeopardy. The unconscious setup that every relationship with a borderline untreated, for both people, neither of whom knows this, is going to result in relational ruptures sooner or later. It's just unavoidable. And so maybe this can help somebody from, not reverse hoovering and not allowing them to hoover you back, and to realize the gravity and the reason why you really need to go no contact, even though it's pretty painful and this might be really hard to hear. I hope it helps people understand. And this setup, by the way, is not something people with BP do consciously at all. It's repetition, compulsion, primal defense mechanisms. It's like when they were mounting the need to, we need what we need from that caregiver, from mother, or that first, object other. And when that goes awry, then there's like, attachment doesn't happen. There's a trauma bond right there, and it's a relational rupture, and they can't do anything but repeat that in repetition, compulsion fashion, which is unconscious, and they cannot change that until they go and get a tremendous amount of therapy.